Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Now, the observant of you will notice that I am not Cathy Morris. I apologise for that. I would try and do an impersonation, but I would probably do it so badly that I will refrain. My name is Alan Bellinger. Cathy, unfortunately, was taken ill last night. Nothing serious, but she couldn't make it today. And so you have me instead. There is one person in this audience who, hearing that this morning, was devastated. And that is our first speaker. David's taken a really interesting challenge here with the concept of the fall and rise of the corporate academy. And the reason that David gave me that sad look this morning was that he has had the misfortune to be chaired with me on 3 occasions in the last 12 months. David, I promise I'll improve. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning. This is your Heidi High moment. So thank you for choosing to come into our session this morning. Hopefully you'll find it worthwhile. My name is David Wilson. I am Managing Director of a company called eLearnity. We're a market analyst, industry analyst, looking at corporate learning. User account control. Thank you. That wasn't me, by the way. We research largely focused on FTSE 100, large corporate organisations, and we've been doing that for about the last 10, 15 years, looking at a whole series of themes where we talk around learning, innovation and technology. Just to put a bit of context around this, the corporate academy question has been floating around in the background for pretty much the entire time that we have been looking at organisations and the way in which they want to structure and offer their learning offer into the business. 5 years ago, 5 and a bit years ago, what we found was that there was a very strong focus around adopting an academy model, and I'll talk a bit more about what's an academy model, etc. In a second, but there was a very strong focus around adopting academy as a vehicle to structure and offer learning across large organisations. And we did some fairly deep research into that. We went involved and interviewed a lot of people that were creating those academies. We looked at how they were structuring those, and we looked at what they were delivering. We then looked at that a year later, 2 years later, etc. At the beginning of last year, we thought we will actually do a formal kind of review point on it. None of the academies that we'd looked at in the original thing existed anymore. So we'd gone from a situation where kind of a corporate academy was a kind of big focus, big story, and getting a lot of traction, towards a situation where none of the specific academies that we'd looked at existed in the same form they did. And one of the challenges is the word academy here is a terminology that can get adopted to mean a lot of different things. But what we also saw at the same time was a situation where academies were also part of the lingua franca of the organizational learning groups, the corporate learning functions, and that they were talking again, almost every organization we talked to was talking about introducing an academy. So, it seemed to be in true Reggie Perrin fashion that, we seem to have a classic situation where the academies had gone from being a very strong concept towards being a very strong concept, and somewhere in the middle, something had gone wrong. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is some of the summary of the key findings, obviously in a very short amount of time. If anybody's interested, there's a viewpoint paper that we created which summarizes a lot of the content that we're talking about today. So more of the words that go along with this are available in there to download. And if you're quick enough with the QR code, and I'll put it back up at the end, that will take you straight to the page that you can download it from. So why academies? So there were key themes that we saw organizations focusing on. So first of all, one, they wanted to focus on driving functional excellence. So typically this is driven by things like sales, leadership, sometimes customer service academies, And then what we started to see was these then functional academies. So you would then say the finance function would then get on the bandwidth, or the marketing function would, and it would create an offering that it was going to then push across the whole organization. And as I'm sure most of you know, obviously in most organizations, learning is still very siloed across the businesses. Sometimes it's moved to being, a corporate university function. Often, if that happens, sometimes that's kind of fallen apart slightly. But often in most organizations, it's fairly decentralized. What they also wanted then was a structured framework for discussing and driving, building people capability and driving performance across that organization structure within that functional thing around functional excellence. They also wanted to be able to create and drive more, to use that framework to drive things around, for example, career plans and structured development planning processes, etc., aligned with job roles and job role families. I'll talk about that in a second. And they also wanted that as a vehicle to be able to deliver and address skill needs. So in other words, this was became and is becoming again a major shop window for key learning programs and resources to be able to provide and deliver against that. So there were a bunch of underlying drivers around why academies became important, and what they were trying to do was to almost change the equation, the relationship between an abstracted learning function with a catalogue of offerings and a business that was trying to achieve certain things in terms of capability and performance outcomes. And what we found when we looked at that, there were really kind of three approaches to it. So the first two is what you might define as a kind of inherently had a sense of a strategy or a template model around them. The first was plant single acorns. So we'll go off with our leadership academy or our sales academy. We'll establish a model. We'll use that as a template, okay, and develop the template for that will then try and sprout and plant new acorns. Okay, so the intent here is to focus on specific areas first, and then to spawn the model, to scale the model to go to other areas. So as I said, there is a sense that there is a strategy behind that is broader than the individual need itself. And there is a sense of a kind of template or best practice model that can go with it. The other one, which was very explicitly a strategic top-down view, was what we describe as strategic cultivation. So we knew we wanted to plant forests, not individual trees, and we knew we wanted multiple forests in different locations, so we actually approached this from a top-down view. We take a very kind of overarching, centralized view around building core and functional capabilities, and then we look into building an organizational design and model, and then capability frameworks and that. So you get the sense of this is very top-down. And certainly some of the organizations we approached with what they were taking, and this is something that we're again seeing now quite a lot of, a more strategic top-down approach where they're not saying, we'll develop one, create the model, spin that into others, but actually we'll define a model, then we'll then adopt that model in 4 or 5, 6 areas right from the beginning. The third model, which is actually quite common, is not the same as what I call about single acorns. So the other one was functional islands, and a really good example of this is often around areas that have been very segmented historically, like IT training. So a number of the organizations created an IT academy, the model of which basically didn't really work or pan out for anybody else. They had made decisions around the competency approach, the platforms that they were going to use, the learning solutions approach. They're effectively only valid in their scenario. But actually, they had done it first. Often the academy name had been adopted around it, and then they had used to build that first of all. And one of the organizations particularly that we looked at, that's what had happened. So these acorns were in fact completely isolated islands that had no really common reference point. And somebody then came along afterwards and said, actually, what we've got is an academy model, let's build this and take it. But actually everybody had so much legacy about where they were, it was almost impossible for them to move forward. The common characteristics, I've already touched on some of these already, often the core one is really around some form of functional capability or competency framework model. So what we're doing is moving away from, and certainly from an L&D perspective, if you like, the solution wagging the dog, here are my training courses, how do I align you to them, towards saying, what capabilities do we want to build in the business? Let's create a model for structuring those, and then let's start to build some learning programs associated with that and align to it. Let's build a structure, let's build a community of people associated with it. And the key subtlety here is about a shift away from, as I said, delivery solutions towards capability and performance. So, you know, and there are a number of people in this room who've stood up on this stage or other stages talking about exactly this thing. You know, focusing on driving capability and performance, creating a structure of that, and actually if you like, the underpinning wiring diagram was more about capabilities than it was around solutions. Mapped on top of that then, we take job role families and generic roles rather than talking about individual jobs. You know, and one of the reasons for that is if you talk about it at an individual job level, you've got thousands of them, if not hundreds of thousands of them, depending on the organisation, and it becomes an impossible feat to actually do it. But focusing around job role families and then starting to define clear career paths and developmental paths through those associated with that. So, for example, again, come back to my example of a finance academy, they would create some clear roles around that within the finance functions, which tend to be distributed across an organisation, trying to drive functional excellence around finance across the whole business, rather than it just being within one or two of the sub-teams. And then they would define those and then define programs that would then align with them. Clearly, around that, you needed a shop window for it. So the other big piece of the equation is the academy portal. And then associated with that, you've got a whole set of tools, a set of learning offers and things. So the Academy portal is a shop window into this. And one of the challenges that we saw actually in a lot of organisations is the sense of identity of the Academy itself became subsumed into the portal. So as far as a lot of the learners were concerned, a lot of the individuals in the company, their view of the Academy was it was the portal. That was a label, it was a brand for the portal, rather than the structures that sat behind it. Some organisations, and this varied to the degree of how much they developed it, also were building in things like knowledge exchanges, collaboration, what you might describe now as informal and social learning tools within these as well. And building that community of excellence alongside the focus on functional excellence is a key thing, I think, in terms of giving these longevity. So if that's what we looked at in terms of what was an academy and why people did it, what were the reasons why maybe some of the ones hadn't persisted, but why still organisations were trying to adopt these models? And we've simplistically anyway, at least, captured those down into 6 kind of keys to success. You know, something around engagement and how you proactively drive engagement in the business, around something around the capability and competency models you're using underneath it, something which is around the effectiveness of the academy model itself. Obviously, the learning and resources, that's critical for a lot of you. That's your kind of what you're focusing on how you deliver. And then above that, some really critical things around governance, business alignment, and impact. So one of the things that was really, I think, quite tangible in terms of determining some of the longevity around the academy model, ultimately was who owned it. Who really owned this? And there's the most tangible piece of that is if an academy is an HR or learning concept only, in other words, it's a way of you shaping your offer onto the business, you're dead. Okay? The academy has value, real value, if it becomes part of the fabric of the way the business looks at the problem. Okay? And where we saw clear alignment around that, we saw a much faster process to delivering value. We saw more coherent adoption within the businesses, and we saw greater longevity of the academies themselves. So engagement and ownership within the business is critical, and in particular, it's critical about how you build that within the line management layers. Ultimately, if the line managers in an organization view it as an alternative training catalogue, you've really failed to get that kind of traction that you need. So it needs to build ultimately they need to see it as part of the answer and to be prepared to impose and drive that forward with their organisation. As I said before, one of the challenges around a good portal is that actually people see the portal as the academy, and that actually that can often be an abdication. You know, come back to line management engagement and their engagement in the processes, their ability to have good conversations around how you drive forward capability and performance can be marginalised by a great portal that looks really sexy, has a lot of stuff on it. You know, it just is a thing to point people at rather than necessarily a process to manage. So the portals are a view into the solutions, they're not the solution themselves, and that's a critical thing to understand. So secondly, the capability models. What we found almost universally was that the capability models took at least 9 to 12 months longer to develop, agree, and execute. And I said at least 9 to 12 months. So in some cases, we're talking about close to 2 years, at which point the whole process had become invalidated, largely in the minds of the business. Introducing those capability frameworks has lots of challenges with it. I've put a few in here, but actually, again, this is something where this is non-trivial. And the risk is, the more you drive it from an HR perspective and from a learning perspective, the more HR and learning becomes the owner of it, not the business. So this is quite a tricky process to be able to kind of navigate through. But do not underestimate the efforts to do this, get it right, get the granularity level right around the capabilities. You can go through a huge process, and we see this in a lot of organizations. They end up with 14 generic competencies that are slightly different to what you could have pulled off the shelf. And then if you're kind of in the business sat there looking at this, you think, and so what? Because it's the same 14 generic competencies virtually that my direct competitors are using. So what value does this add? So finding out, making this really work is a critical thing.
David, timeliness is one of the critical competencies.
And I am at?
About 3 minutes to go.
Okay, perfect. Okay. This is our agreed protocol. He embarrasses me in front of you, and then I hopefully speed up. Time to effective value, talk about timing. Time to effective value is a really critical thing. The academy cannot be, you want it to be strategic and long-term, but it cannot be a strategic and long-term development. Time to value is critical. The faster that you show an impact in the business, the faster that you can generate real value from this, you build engagement in the business. It's not, again, rocket science. If you don't build the engagement in the business, the thing becomes unthreaded, etc. So that becomes a really critical piece. Learning and resources, again, this is a huge area in its own right, but one of the key things, obviously, on academies have moved away from a training catalogue view. They've therefore actually started to aggressively move, and I mean quite aggressively, from a formalised training model, even though actually they're building structured development plans and career planning, development plan across career lines in generic job role families. There's a lot of focus on what other kinds of resources, including collaborative, social, and the forums, and the informal resources, and so on. And actually, this is a really good vehicle for actually driving a shift away from a formal model to more towards 70-20-10, etc. 70-20-10 often makes a lot more sense when you build into this kind of functionally driven academy structure. It's easier for people to relate to and understand, including the learning team. Governance was probably ultimately, and this links back into sponsorship, into business engagement, and into a whole range of things, and particularly obviously when you've got a range of academies. So some of them can be really successful in certain parts of the business, but others are complete dismal failure. So understanding how you drive that perception of value and the best practice and build the governance process is really a critical piece. And coming back to my time to value, impact. Measure and communicate impact. That means this is not something you can abstain from. And actually one of the reasons that we found, which was most obvious from looking at the ones that ceased to exist, was that they had no sense of the value they really added because they hadn't bothered measuring it up front. Nearly all of them had identified this as a critical issue, and most of them had done really very little to actually be able to make it tangible. So therefore, if your point is to drive functional value and excellence, how do you prove it? Okay? Because everybody will see the fact that it's taking a long time to agree the competencies. They'll see what you're spending in terms of learning programs and the portal, etc. But you need to be able to prove value. So having said all of that, 2 slides. That was for Alan, by the way. 2 slides. So, you know, there is a kind of, what's the word? I have a kind of love-hate thing here, right? So it is clear academies are hugely relevant. It is clear to us that almost all of the large corporate organizations we're looking at are looking at academies as a way of driving greater value and greater traction and to transition or transform their learning offer in the business. But you're using a kind of flower analogy, you know, if they are a flower, then they're seldom resilient at the moment. You know, and building resilience is a critical thing because that's going to build you long-term value. The potential is still very high, but understanding how you build that, what the mix is around things like the relationship between the community of practice itself and the academy offer itself are critical in terms of building that longer term. So if academies are a perennial flower, they certainly seem to be coming back every 3 to 5 years, if not on an annual basis. You know, they're not very hardy currently. Sharp frost, you know, for example, the person leading the exercise has disappeared. Sharp frost, they're gone. Suddenly we've got a new broom, we've got somebody coming in, and we've got a new initiative. You need to work out how they weave into the business process. They need to be a business-owned thing, not a learning exercise. Yeah? Otherwise, they might be a very short bloom indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We've got a few minutes for questions. I'm going to, we need to do questions through the mic if possible because the session's being recorded, so if we don't get it on the mic, then it doesn't work. But who's going to, Nigel, thank you.
Is not allowed to ask a question.
Okay, I won't ask a question.
You'll make a statement.
This is not my question.
Okay.
Do you agree that one of the other fundamental drivers is simply to refresh learning? It's just to make it look different, feel different, so that even if the details are fuzzy, the mere existence kind of changes everything just by its nature almost.
So I think absolutely that's the case. I assume everybody could hear that, so I won't repeat the question. But it is absolutely a driver, and particularly where the academy initiative is driven from the learning function. Okay? So the key risk in that is that it doesn't necessarily lead to real business traction and for it to be, as the words I used before, woven into the process of the business. But definitely, it's a new shop window with a new set of, toys, and it's about building, often the other goal clearly within the academy is to build a much more user-friendly, user-engaged experience. So it's about building user engagement. So definitely there's part of that refresh. The challenge is if that's all it is, and it's how superficial that is. The problem with the shop window is I still go in the store and I've got all the same boring stuff inside, and those others are out of stock. So it's about what's behind that, Again, on a pyramid sense, it's about what's in the body of the pyramid, not just what appears on the top of it.
On my way.
Do you have examples of where academies have been set up industry-wide as opposed to just for a particular business, and how successful have those been, if there are any?
So yes, of course there are examples. I've specifically focused this in talking about academies within a corporate context. Obviously there was a government initiative around creating industry-based academy models and using some of the sector skills councils to drive some of those as well. I guess from our deep research point of view, that's slightly out of scope. What we found was, looking at it from the corporate lens inwards, that there was, I would say, partial engagement with those industry-wide academy models from within the corporates. And it depended quite a lot on the sector, and it depended on the type of staff. So, for example, where you had lots of transactional workers, where it was maybe a lower skills environment, or you have very explicit industry where you've got strong apprenticeship structures, then potentially cross-industry academy models clearly made more sense. If I go into the most organisations, I'll look at their finance academy, their sales academy, their leadership academy, they would tend to be bespoke built for those organisations, although they did use or leverage resources that were available from sometimes industry-wide offerings, if that makes sense.
David, I've got a large number of very geographically distributed line managers. From your research and your experience, what's the best way to really engage with line managers and really get them on board?
So I think that's a much bigger question, obviously, than maybe an academy. I think when you had, functional or role-based commonalities across those, academies can provide really quite a good vehicle for creating a coherent overall offer. And as I said, if they contain the sort of elements that we saw with them, then that can make sense and be translated into those different geographies. One of the things that we did find, though, is that often somebody created a model that made sense, for example, in group and maybe 1 or 2 geographies. But as soon as they tried to roll that model into South America or into Asia or something, they had to be radically repurposed. And actually one of the big drivers around that was cost, because a lot of the core program delivery around some of the real high value programs that were embedded in them, basically the economic model didn't translate to the next country. So I could go out and deliver it. I took a cost model built around UK and US, for example, paying, say if we got instructor delivery around it, paying thousands, a couple of $1,000s a day for an instructor to go out and roll core programs, and I go and take it into geographies where they pay $300 a day equivalent. And they're saying, look, we don't, it's a question of who's funding that then as well. So I think there's issues around line manager engagement, there's issues around localization and relevance. Relevance is a key word, I think, in this. How do you make it relevant in those audience? But there's also something around delivery economics as well. And that's one of the problems where a lot of the original academies we saw, the core offer was still built around, for want of a better word, classroom-based or blended programs, which were quite expensive to deliver, because they were really focusing on the big block capability areas. So actually having a model that is scalable and makes sense in a local site, as well as being locally relevant, I think is important. There's a broader question, of course, around line manager engagement in learning, period, which I think is probably another subject for conversation. And clearly that affects. If you're in a culture where there's generally reasonable engagement with the importance of learning and the relevance of learning and development to individuals and so on, and to manage, then obviously that can be easier. But obviously in a lot of organisations, there's almost an antipathy towards it. One quadrant sort of a balanced scorecard kind of thing. And if that's the case, then ultimately, or in some cases, 3 quadrants short. So
I'm going to have to cut short at that point, I'm afraid. David,
any other questions, obviously, see me afterwards.
Thank you very much indeed.